Hi, girls. How are you? We are beginning something new. Isn't that exciting? We are beginning blood. Take a moment just to pause and read this. All right. So it's interesting to say that this is really the number one function of blood, transport and delivery. Okay, let's look at what are called the blood's formed elements. These are three cells or cell fragments which are in the blood. You already know them. Red blood cells, notice this name, you want to be able to recognize it, erythrocytes. Cyte, C-Y-T-E, means cell. Erythrocytes. White blood cells, leukocytes, that's the leuko that leukemia comes from, and platelets, which are not actual cells, but they're cell fragments. And all of these cell fragments are floating in plasma. That's the liquid medium of blood. Here's a picture of them. Kind of a cool picture. You recognize the typical red blood cell. These would be much, much tinier. These are not to scale, and these would be significantly bigger. Notice there's a huge variety of the white blood cells. You had learned about these and these, but we'll review them. Okay, to give a really super summarized function of each one, red blood cells transport oxygen, white blood cells defend the body from pathogens, fight pathogens, and they do it in very many different ways. Each one of these has a different method of fighting. And platelets are involved in blood clotting. The scientific name for that is coagulation. And blood clotting is not a continuous need like the delivery of oxygen is. It's needed just when there is an injury, really a tear to a blood vessel, and it's to prevent excessive bleeding from that tear. Okay, here's a picture. It's a real photograph of blood cells and cell fragments, and all three of them are present. Can you recognize them? Notice one thing. This is the typical shape you see. You probably have guessed this is a red blood cell. Also this one. But red blood cells are really flexible, and so these don't look so typical, but they can get, they're like little pillows. They get changed shape very easily. So here to help you recognize them, they added color, and I think it's pretty obvious. These were obviously the red blood cells. These are white blood cells. I believe these ones are lymphocytes, or they might be macrophages, and these are platelets, the little blue ones. Okay, all of these are produced in the bone marrow. Inside your bone, there is this soft stuff, and it makes blood cells. It makes white blood cells, red blood cells, and platelets, and here again is the summary of their jobs. The making of blood cells is extremely important. It's constant work. It's happening continuously, and there are hormones involved in regulating the right amount, that the right amount are made. One little thing, so they're made in the bone marrow, but there's one little addition to that. Lymphocytes, if you remember lymphocytes, they're the most complex of the white blood cells. They begin to be made in the bone marrow, but their completion, they're fully developed in the thymus, lymph nodes, and spleen. You can remember that because they're lymphocytes, so they're linked to these lymphatic organs. All right, we're going to begin to look at the red blood cell more closely. So the red blood cell has this all-important protein called hemoglobin. This is a picture of hemoglobin. It's a really complex protein. It's made of 4 different proteins, and it can attach to 4 different oxygen molecules. And your red blood cell has 300 million hemoglobin proteins, 300 million hemoglobin molecules in each of them. So here's a red blood cell packed with hemoglobin molecules. And the hemoglobin molecules are super attracted to oxygen. They have a way of attracting oxygen, which passes through the cell membrane, and each hemoglobin carries 4 little oxygens, and they carry them through the bloodstream, and there's a certain way in which they're released when they reach tissues which are oxygen poor, which are in need of oxygen. So that's how the oxygen is delivered. So hemoglobin is a super important protein. Without that, we wouldn't be able to get oxygen. We'd be able to breathe it in our lungs, but it couldn't be delivered to tissues. Okay, an RBC is biconcave. That means it's concave on both sides, on top and on the bottom. Can you figure out why? Take a moment to see if you can think about it. It's a concept that I love and that I keep returning to again and again because it keeps returning anatomy. And it's something that starts with an S. Did you guess it? Surface area. A biconcave shape has more surface area. If we're flat, there'd be a little bit less surface area. And that's important because the oxygen has more surface really to diffuse through the membrane and get to the hemoglobin. Red blood cells are really small and flexible. Remember I said they were kind of like pillows? They can be bent to fit into tiny capillaries and just to kind of squeeze into tight spots. They travel through blood vessels non-stop, right? They live a life of continual motion. And so they get kind of beat up. They get wear and tear. They get old. So after about 120 days, obviously that should say 4 months, they're old enough and damaged enough or worn out enough that they need to be destroyed and new ones are made continuously. So here's a summary of everything. The hemoglobin for carrying oxygen, the lifespan 120 days, they're made in the bone marrow, and the bone marrow produces 2 million red blood cells a second. This is a cool picture because it shows a blood vessel wall and the liquid medium, the plasma, you can't see, but you can see the way red blood cells are flowing through it. Okay, you can read through this. I think it's all pretty straightforward. The last detail is red blood cells, which are old and damaged, are removed in the liver and in the spleen. Here's an image of the spleen. Remember we studied that? The spleen and the liver, they filter out red blood cells when they find the old and damaged ones, and there are macrophages that eat them up, that ingest them to destroy them. Quick reminder of what macrophages are. Here, this is a macrophage, right? It's a white blood cell. In this case, it's a bacteria that it's going to eat up and digest. The lysosome is full of digestive enzymes, right? But in this case, it's happening with old or damaged red blood cells because macrophages eat pathogens, but they also eat old damaged tissue. Okay, so red blood cell life cycle, made in bone marrow, circulates for 120 days, and this represents the liver, this represents the spleen, and this is a macrophage eating up the old ones and the bad ones. This is the same thing. The life cycle, I just thought this might help you. It's different, right? This is the bone marrow. It's actually inside the spongy bone is this soft red marrow, which is producing the red blood cells. This represents a blood vessel where it's circulating. And these are the two places where it's phagocytized. That's the word for being destroyed by macrophages, the spleen and the liver. Okay, notice that hemoglobin contains iron. And this is the reason that iron is so important in our diet. We need iron to be able to have hemoglobin to be able to transport oxygen. Because iron is so important and it's not present in large quantities in food, your body in this life cycle, when it destroys the red blood cells, it recycles the iron. The iron gets back to the bone marrow so it can use it again. But we still lose blood and we still need iron in our diet. Lack of iron can cause anemia, can cause lack of hemoglobin, therefore inadequate oxygen that we're receiving. And the symptoms of that are fatigue, weakness, breathlessness, right? Can you think why women are more at risk for that than men? Hopefully you realize because we lose more blood, right? We lose blood regularly. And so it's a risk of ours. Okay. White blood cells, look how cool they are. Look how many of them there are. We're not going to learn everything about them. It gets super complex, but we'll learn a little bit. A monocyte, the other name for it is a macrophage. So this is the one that we looked at the picture of a few minutes ago. So let's go through them. Huge variety of types, and they all have a different way of fighting pathogens. The monocyte or the macrophage is the one you know the best. It's a large white blood cell which phagocytizes, a fancy verb for ingesting through phagocytosis, right? So ingests and digests, therefore destroys the pathogens. It was the one that I always used to call a Pac-Man. Now we're going to call it a big Pac-Man because guess what else there is? There's little Pac-Man, neutrophils. Neutrophils are smaller, but they also use phagocytosis, just like a macrophage. They're sometimes called the first responders because they're present everywhere in the body. They're the most common white blood cell. They're present everywhere, and so they're ready to attack pathogens immediately. And they're small, so they can fit into lots of places really quickly. So we're going to call them big Pac-Man and little Pac-Man, but don't overlook the real terms: phagocytosis, ingesting and digesting, etc. Okay. Oh, this was just to review. This is, a phagocyte is a term for both a macrophage or a neutrophil. And this is a picture which shows it, right? This red thing is the pathogen or the virus. These are the lysosomes full of digestive enzymes, etc. They get digested and then spit out. Actually, they don't always get spit out. Sometimes Sometimes a macrophage is attacking so many bacteria and viruses that a lot of these remains of the bacteria stay inside the macrophage, and the macrophage dies. It basically is a hero that dies in battle because it just gets full of the toxins from bacteria and viruses. Okay, this is a real photograph. Isn't that crazy? It's a white blood cell, even though they colored it red. The color's always added. These are bacteria, and you wouldn't have imagined it from the pictures, but it makes these long, thin extensions to grab them when it's activated. That's a whole other thing, how macrophages are activated. Obviously, we're not going to study it. Here you can see they're being ingested. Once they're ingested, they get digested. Another picture of macrophages, but this time it's old red blood cells that are being ingested. Do you remember where this occurs? What are the two organs where this occurs? The liver and the spleen. And then remember that the iron and actually some other things from the red blood cell are recycled. Okay, next type of white blood cell, lymphocytes. Do you remember talking about them when we talked about the lymphatic system? There's lots of these in lymph nodes. So there's actually two types, B cells and T cells. We'll learn about them more later. These are the white blood cells which can be really specific. They can identify a specific pathogen and attack just that pathogen. So they're what produce what's so famous and also talked about a lot in these days, antibodies, and what can help us create immunity against a specific disease. This is a slower, longer job, but it's extremely effective and it's long term. So lymphocytes are important in a different way. We're going to focus on these after we finish the unit on blood so that we can learn what immunity is and what antibodies are. Okay. All right, the last types are eosinophils and basophils. This we already talked about, but I'll tell you in a moment. So eosinophils and basophils it gets very confusing and very technical. So we're just going to learn a general definition. So they are full of granules. See all these little things they're full of? These are like little vesicles of fluid, of chemicals. They're specific types of chemicals. They release these chemicals into their surroundings when they've been activated, and these chemicals can do different things. Some of them are like a poison. They harm a pathogen by poisoning a pathogen. Some of them are ways to stimulate our immune system. They can stimulate inflammation. They can call other white blood cells to come quickly for help. So they become chemical signals. Okay? We're not going to learn which ones do which or when or how. We're just going to know these granules are ways to either poison a pathogen or signal your body's immune system. The name of those white blood cells, sometimes they're called granulocytes. Remember, cyte means cells, so cells full of granules. Notice that their nuclei are multi-lobed. They're really weird, right? The white blood cells are really weird looking. And the last thing is, this guy we studied before, this is little Pac-Man. This is a phagocytosis. So a neutrophil is really important because it has two roles. It's a granulocyte and it's a little Pac-Man. So this is by far the most common white blood cell out there. Okay, so here's the summary. Go over it, make sure you can characterize each one. When you do your homework, you can be a little more specific than this, but this is a good way to have all the information in your mind pretty quickly and easily. Okay. Remember, white blood cells are made in the bone marrow, but the complex ones, the lymphocytes, are also made in the thymus and the spleen. And now this is a real photograph. This is a blood smear, which means they took a drop of someone's blood and looked at it under the microscope. These are all red blood cells. You see that many of them have that typical shape where it's thinner in the center, but they vary a lot. They kind of change shapes and can become lumpy. These big ones are white blood cells. You might recognize the biggest is a monocyte. That's like a macrophage. A lymphocyte is more dense. A neutrophil with the crazy many-lobed nucleus. And these little tiny ones we haven't talked about yet. Those are the cell fragments called platelets. What do platelets do? So these tiny cell fragments are involved in blood clotting or in coagulation. So let's try to study this. This is a real photograph from a scanning electron microscope of a platelet. This is a platelet that's resting, that's not been activated, and this one has been activated. They do this crazy transformation when they get activated. Platelets activate when there is an injury or a blood vessel tear, a tear in the blood vessel, right? Just like a rip.